So I want to start by thanking you all for joining us tonight. I'm Andrew Tomalonis, editor of The Light, and I welcome you all to another of The Light's Community Conversations. This is a forum where we can explore issues raised by our reporters in greater detail and perhaps take them one step further, maybe even finding solutions to problems. It's all a part of our efforts to inform and engage readers for better participation in government and community affairs. So we've had these conversations on addiction issues, sober homes, rising seas, the continuum of care and treatment of substance abuse disorder, and now South Coast Rail and Southern Transit. So we couldn't have asked for a better panel of experts today for this discussion, so I'll introduce the members now. So we have with us State Rep. Bill Straus. He's chaired the legislature's Transportation Committee for the past 14 years, and for the last 32 years, Bill has been elected as a state representative for several towns in the New Bedford region, including a portion of the city itself. As transportation chair, he's played important roles in the coming South Coast Rail project and transportation issues around the state. Before elective office, he was an assistant district attorney in Bristol County, and he also practiced law for many years in New Bedford. We have from the City of New Bedford, we have Jennifer Carloni, New Bedford's Director of Planning. And before that, she was a town planner in North Attleboro and a senior planner for New Bedford. She also served as transportation planner for SRTA, the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District. We have Paul Chase. Paul Chase wears a lot of hats. He's CEO for the Realtor Association of Southeastern Massachusetts, a real estate trade organization that encompasses nearly 1,800 members in 30 cities and towns. Paul currently sits on numerous state and national realtor and legislative advocacy committees, in addition to being chairperson of the Rail to Boston Coalition, which is the primary reason we got him here tonight. And he's also chairperson for the New Bedford Redevelopment Authority and a member of the New Bedford Economic Development's Regeneration Committee. We have Jean Fox. Jean is Director of Community Engagement for the South Coast Rail. And she's also in her third term at the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women. Prior to that, she served on regional Bristol County Commission for the Status of Women. In her leadership positions with South Coast Rail, she directed the project through the design and permitting process from 2012 until 2019, then transitioned to the outreach role as the project entered its construction phase. We have Eric Rousseau. He's been an administrator and CEO at the Southeastern Regional Transit Authority, more commonly known as SRTA, for roughly a dozen years. He was a manager at First Transit and a bus driver, trainer, dispatcher at UConn's Office of Transportation Services. So he's got experience from the top to the bottom in transportation. And Grace Ferguson is with us on the big screen behind us. So she wanted to be here, but she fell ill, and so she has to join us through the miracle of Zoom. So there's a lot of questions I think we all have, but I think I want to start out jumping right into it with Bill Straus. So why the heck has it taken so long? What are the what are the problems and stages of many different delays that we've had at South Coast Rail?
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the obvious question. I guess the phrase is the elephant in the room. Hey, what the heck? Why aren't we riding the train yet? That's the fair question, and let me take a shot at it. I'll answer first half in jest and then two more serious substantive responses. I am reminded after 20 plus years of a different transportation project to the east of us, Fairhaven and Mattapoisett, the bike path, when that finally got completed to a significant level, linking the two centers of town. I remember 20, 25 years of people advocating for it, against it, opposition, permitting, funding, all of the typical things. And then it got going, and people started coming up to me saying, what took so long? Yeah, when the questions used to be, why do we even need it, or why should we have it? With South Coast Rail, it's similar kind of issues, but writ large. And so I won't go into all the years that led up to what I have said publicly many times was a critical green light decision by then Governor Baker. People had, in different ways, been supportive, but it really is to former Governor Baker's credit to have said, no, we're going to do it. I gave my word, and so I've never shied away from recognizing his role. And then we had groundbreaking 4 or 5 years ago. Governor Healy and her administration have been very supportive. But that brings us to, well, what in a construction sense has taken so long? So the public statements to date, and I have the luxury of being answerable to the voters, so I'm not in any other food chain, as it were. The statements have focused, and they're accurate, that what remains is now the critical safety testing. Unlike systems built years ago, around the country now, existing systems and new ones like this, or extensions of service like this, have a much higher level of safety control. There's a technical term, positive train control, but what it really means is with the electronics and communication software and technology available today, the trains that are out on these tracks, in essence, speak to each other, communicate with each other, so that if a driver either loses control or loses attention, becomes unattentive to the train vehicle, the communications within the network will stop the train and restore a safe situation. So that requires, from a construction standpoint, for an old line, an old freight line, as this was being built upon, a very high level of technical skill, state-of-the-art equipment, then to be followed by the testing. Test trains started yesterday at speeds that are, in some cases, 3 times the speed of the freight trains that occasionally we've grown used to seeing. You don't have to go very far in Googling about the danger of rail crossings to where crossings occur on roadways, or even more tragically sometimes with trespassers on the property itself. Our eyes are not used to the speed at which these travel. We'll become used to it, but it's a new hazard, and the testing of the safety equipment has to be done in a very real way. That's one of the 2 substantive reasons. The one that I do want to point to in answering the question, and I apologize for going on this long, but I think the question deserves it, is that remember the context where we were with MBTA operations generally about 2 years ago from a safety standpoint. Not here, but we would read about green line issues in Boston, track gauge incorrect, a train line, the green line extension, being put into service before it was really safe. Fires on the trains. An incident where fortunately no one was hurt with an Orange Line train crossing the bridge, where people jumped out of the windows and went off the bridge into the river or the harbor. So in that context, the Healy administration appointed a new general manager who I think is doing quite well, Phil Ang, to run the T. But what that means, if unstated it shouldn't be, is that you did have people who were in positions, maybe that they weren't doing the best job possible. It's public record that with regard to South Coast Rail, a few months ago, a key staff person was replaced. You don't replace people who are doing the tip-top job. So the safety issues, the delay in getting us to the safety standpoint, I don't think you have to read between too many lines, relates to what was expected when Phil Ang was appointed by Governor Healy, that a new culture would occur within the T, focused on service, but most importantly, safety. And that extends to the ongoing construction projects, capital projects like South Coast Rail. So some responsibility or some cause does occur here in the delay because people needed to be replaced. So I actually cheer that on. I'm not happy about a delay any more than anybody else. We're all impatient, as we should be, but there are these reasons. And I think in the end, once service starts, people will and should have the knowledge that it is a safe, operable system. So the specific date, I still don't know, other than into 2025. But I do know that when it's put into service, unlike other systems, it will be ready. And ultimately, that's, I think, the most important thing. Again, I'm sorry for extending my response, but I thought that this is a question that merits it. Thanks.
Well, it deserved a long response because the rail has been a long time coming. So that's good. There's a big difference between a vehicle that's traveling 29 miles an hour or so and one that's going about 80 miles an hour. So understood why there's safety checks needed. For Gene, and maybe with a follow-up from Paul, I'd like to ask a question about, well, with rail, there's all this talk of renewed commercial interest in connecting to the region, and to what extent are we seeing that commercial business coming in anticipation of rail? So we can either whoever wants to take it first.
Okay. So from the real estate side, we're seeing a lot of interest from businesses, and not just businesses, but also the ties between educational institutions, right? Bridgewater State, UMass Boston, there's that. But the economic interests out there back and forth we've been talking about that for a couple of years now, since the construction essentially began. And I think it was even one of the last public events that the MBTA had just the other day. Someone had suggested, a rail car that comes down that, you could bring bikes on the weekend and go out to Martha's Vineyard. So there's a lot of economic development that's being talked about right now. And that's something that Gene could probably talk to a little, and potentially even Jen. But I'll tell you, from the real estate side on the economic development, there's a lot of excitement about the back and forth economy.
Gene?
Sure. One of the things that I find very exciting that's happened in the last several years is renewed interest in what we call transit-oriented development. So that's mixed-use properties, developments near stations. So you don't have to get in your car to go. There's usually a little grocery store nearby. It's very common down in the DC area, for example, where the train is the spine and every station is walkable and has amenities. So you get off the train, whether you're in Virginia, Maryland, or in the middle of downtown DC, and everything you need is right there. Well, we have a big development going in Taunton. It's still in the planning phases right now, but it's got well over 200 units and 4 buildings that'll be right next to the station there. We expect it to attract people who are challenged with prices in the greater Boston area, but who can now get on a train in Taunton and get to Boston in 60 or 70 minutes. Certainly worth the effort. And we're seeing similar such developments elsewhere along the corridor where developers are coming in. There's one in Middleborough who's looking at the area, has already bought the property. And I believe we'll see some more of that around here, because one of the things the project did in the early days was funded technical assistance grants that allowed communities to plan in advance of rail stations, to look at zoning, to look at walkability, to look at housing production plans, bike and ped plans, things of that nature, so that it's a hub that people can get to. Usually walkable is no more than about a half-mile away from the actual station, but you can use your bike, you can get there easily, and then when you get off at the end of the day, whether you're a commuter, a student, a visitor, everything you need is within reach. Without where I live, everything is get in the car and it's 10 miles away. So we're hoping that more transit-oriented development interests arise. I expect they will. They are in line with the administration's focus on making sure we have housing stock. And it makes sense to have people able to find a home and get the amenities they need near a transit hub.
Thank you. Maybe I'll follow up with a question to Eric then. Since Jean mentioned the transit areas, what we need to have, obviously, I think you need to have regional transportation to get people around to different places other than just into Boston and back. So how do you see the role of SRTA working with that? Either take people from different areas toward the stations, or to just take people in the city around to different locations so that they don't need cars and they don't need the extra parking spots.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for including me in this conversation. I really do appreciate that. The Southeastern Regional Transit Authority has really changed quite a bit in the last 13 years. We nearly touched 3 million trips provided a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic. And at this point, we're heading right back to it. We move about 10,000 people on an average weekday. We've peaked around 13,000 people on a weekday. We just added Sunday service, which is phenomenal. We're already moving 4,000 people a day on Sunday service, which matches our fall Saturday service. And having a pedestrian bridge here in downtown is going to be a real boost, because we currently have 4 buses an hour go by the train station on Acushnet Avenue. We have an additional 10 buses an hour that will be going by the pedestrian bridge. So 14 times an hour in that area, you'll be able to get on and ride with us. Do we need more improvements? We do. We need to run later into the evening. We need to run earlier in the morning. We need better frequency. But we're getting there, and we have great leadership and a fantastic delegation that's been supportive.
Great. And how, just a curiosity, how is ridership then with free tickets and the extra Sunday service?
I think that free service obviously does help boost ridership, and we're seeing about a 20% increase. However, access is always the most important thing, reliability. So being able to run early enough in the morning, being able to run late enough at night, gives people the opportunity to make the choices to ride public transportation. While having it free is nice right now, that is temporary. It may continue, it may not. But what we want to make sure that we're able to do is to be where the customer expects us to be when they expect us to be there.
Great, thank you. Grace, I'm wondering if you have any questions related especially to the transportation-oriented development. You've written about it before. And it seemed to be that a lot of people in New Bedford sort of misunderstood or just thought that no way, you can't have these many houses without 2 cars, 2 parking places for each tenant. People are just going to park on the street and it's going to get worse. So maybe you have some questions. So do you have questions on that, Grace?
Yeah, when we covered transit-oriented development in the fall, there was definitely... Can you hear me now? I can hear you guys. Okay, great. When we covered transit-oriented development in the fall, it definitely fired some people up. I think anytime you talk about parking, people are interested. They want to know, am I going to be able to find parking near where I live? And these transit-oriented districts that the city is setting up around train stations are there to encourage more transit-oriented development, like Jean described, walkable neighborhoods, a mix of businesses and housing, and Jen can certainly elaborate on that. And part of that is having a little bit less parking. And so we looked at a development that was near one of the train stations that was sort of anticipating this zoning. It hasn't been introduced yet, but the developer sort of saw what was coming, and he was planning to do a development that had less parking. And it made people nervous about what was going to happen. And so I think that those conversations, we're going to see those start to play out more over the course of the summer and this fall as those zoning changes come to the city council. But I'd love to hear more from Jen on how the city is setting up these zoning districts and what that's going to entail.
Okay. All right, well, I did want to ask also about, you'd mentioned the development. Remember back when, yes?
I think Jeff was going to comment.
Oh, okay, all right, go ahead, Jen, sorry. Just jump in.
Well, if you have a question, Andia.
No, go ahead.
So Jen Carloni, Director of the Department of City Planning for New Bedford. And as Grace alluded to, we are looking at transit-oriented development districts around this train station. So that's zoning to encourage development to meet the needs around the train station. So if we're looking at, as Grace indicated, Kings Highway, for example. So the train station along Church Street, we're looking at targeted areas around the train station. It's on Church Street. You've got a lot of mills. You've got an underutilized plaza. Those areas, how do we charge them up? How do we get some development that we're not seeing of vacant plazas? How do we get activity there? So that's where we're looking at adding density where it's appropriate. Again, respecting the neighborhoods. I live in the North End. I've lived in that neighborhood for a decade. You know, we're trying to right size it. We're trying to make sure that it matches, but exactly to Jean's point, we're creating these mixed districts. We're allowing for those uses. We're allowing for that density in those areas to create that connectivity, to see some more activity, because transportation does connect us all. It connects us to our neighborhoods. It connects us to the other cities. So it's not just Boston. We're also connecting to Brockton. We're also connecting to Taunton. So that's a real intercity connection that we're making. And so bringing people from New Bedford to those communities, bringing them back, and being able to utilize these as hubs is an important piece of our strategy.
Okay, thank you. So I'll direct this next question to Paul. And the other thing we hear in addition to complaints about the not having enough parking is you hear that rail is going to bring gentrification and it'll drive out some of the people who can't afford to live in New Bedford. Is that a valid concern?
I think the more valid concern is the lack of inventory driving gentrification in the area. So what we always envisioned the rail to do is to bring access to the folks of New Bedford for the purpose of jobs, for the purpose of education, for the purpose of healthcare. There are a lot of older folks that can't drive to Boston for healthcare that they may need. There are a lot of younger folks, and I keep going back to this. I say this every time if you've seen me talk before. Way back in the beginning when we started first talking about the MBTA, there was a younger girl that had come up to me after one of the meetings and said, do you know that I was offered a full scholarship to MIT that I could not take, but if the rail were here now, I would have jumped right on it. And, you know, it's opportunities like that for New Bedford residents, as well as Fall River and Taunton, that just kind of stick with me. So going back to the original issue about gentrification, you know, New Bedford recently put out a study, the Economic Development Council Regeneration Committee that I sit on back in December and January, that shows that we're clearly behind on inventory. 8,700 houses by 2030. That is not an MBTA issue, that is not a commuter rail issue, that is an issue that we've had building for years. The fact is that before the MBTA even started construction back in 2019, home prices were only $220,000 here in New Bedford, and today they're $350,000. So that's not because of MBTA construction, that's because of lack of inventory. And the same can be said for rental properties. So rental properties are the same way. So if you have a lack of inventory for homes, in this area we also have a lack of inventory of housing of all kinds. That includes multifamilies. And what we're seeing now is the dynamic between lack of inventory and folks that have purchased multifamily homes 50, 60 years ago that are now retiring, they're now moving, they're now downsizing, and they're selling these homes, and they're selling them for what they feel they're allowed to sell it for, right? Like everybody else. They sell a multifamily home now, they bought it for $50,000, now they sell it for $400,000. But the problem is that $400,000 mortgage on 7 or 8% interest rate doesn't allow you to rent it for $700 anymore. So, you know, I think part of the issue we have is for a long time, we were kind of stuck in the past and we were enjoying very, very low rental rates for a long time. And now that this transition is happening, we're jumping quick. There's no doubt about that. There's a 17% jump between 2023 and 2024. But we're still by far the most affordable in the entire state. So what it comes down to is inventory. We need more inventory, and it's just not the City of New Bedford. It is the surrounding areas. It is all areas of the South Coast that we're all going to have to step up and figure out a way. And there's no one silver bullet. There's accessory dwelling units. There's townhouses. There's condos. There's single-family homes and less zoning restrictions in the suburbs. There's all kinds of ways we can address that. But to say that commuter rail will drive gentrification on its own is, I don't believe to be true, and I think it's the opposite. I think it helps the residents of our area with opportunities.
Okay, great. Well, I have a question that kind of goes a little bit to Jen and a little bit to Eric. So, in terms of the way people move around in different cities, Boston's a famous, that walking city, and New Bedford has neighborhoods that are good driving distance apart. How do you see people moving around the city, say, 25 years from now? In the city and with respects to Boston?
Yeah, so we've really been working on expanding our fixed route service, and 25 years from now, it could go in a number of different ways. There are things today that are happening that nobody could have dreamed of 25 years ago. We run a very robust paratransit service, which is a van service that goes from your origin to your destination most of the time, door to door. And that's for all of our ADA customers. There's some work being done with microtransit. We currently have a grant that was awarded from MassDOT to pilot microtransit to the train stations when the train comes. But that's kind of usually limited to a catchment area of about a mile or 2 mile radius to make a connection. And with that information, we can find additional fixed routes that may help us make those better connections. But I think one thing that's always interesting is people come and they say, oh, well, that bus has been running on that road for 120 years. Why wouldn't you move it? I say, well, actually, the trolley tracks that are largely still underground on many of the streets, and all the development happened along those trolley tracks. So we continue to run the buses there. We might see different types of buses. We might see hydrogen fuel cell buses, but I think you're going to see something that looks very similar, just with new technology and better connections.
Okay. Jennifer, you're a planner, so how are you planning for the future? Maybe not 25 years, because that's a science fiction.
Oh, but I'll take the 25 years.
But maybe.
I mean, we typically plan in decades, so we're currently working on a citywide comprehensive plan, that's a decade plan. But to answer the 25 question, I do want to note that by 25 years, we would like to see that we have our phase 2 of South Coast Rail also in progress, so that we can get that faster connection to Boston. So that would be ideal for 25 years out. And then in terms of connectivity, the decisions we make today in transportation absolutely are for long term, right? That's how we planners look at that. And so for planning for a city, we do want to look at everything as multimodal. We're looking at complete streets. That means if you're on a bike, if you're a pedestrian, if you're a bus, if you're a tractor trailer trying to make deliveries, we're all in the same space. We all need to be able to go through those areas safely and effectively. And the funding needs to be there in place to make those projects work. And that's typically through your state and federal funds. And then as well as the operational piece that Eric was talking about, making those connections, increasing those frequencies, seeing the bus service in a real robust way. 25 years from now would be the goal. And then our development pattern can be supported through our zoning, such as the TOD districts that we've got funding for. So really we think of that in a comprehensive look, because transportation is the thread that weaves us together. It is our ability to connect to one another. It's our ability to connect to the economy. And so having a robust transportation system that has all modes available to us, whether that's waterfront in the port, to the transit, but the train and the buses, as well as air and land transportation for cargo and whatnot. So that would be the dream.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that, just two quick thoughts. I would be the last one to try and convey the message that all will be well, everyone will be happy. If you were to have this same forum 5 or 10 years from now, and that it won't be without some controversy, as the impact of connecting to commuter rail plays itself out in many different ways within the region. And on that, a point that I'd like to point out to people is many of the people who will be riding the train from downtown New Bedford or the Church Street station don't live here yet. There will be existing population, of course, that will take advantage of the access to the train. But people have to realize that in opening a community up in terms of its access along what Jean referred to accurately as that spine, running through Taunton, through the middle of the Bridgewater campus, and north up to Boston, there will be people who will come for the first time to this region. They will have a further economic impact, and there will be people, I don't know when the first article will appear in New Bedford Light, where people are quoted saying, "I wish it had never happened." But that article is coming. I don't know which publication it will appear in first, but it's inevitable, and people have to understand this is not going to be, I would say, universally the subject of praise. The other point I want to make is, so far, myself included, we've talked about this using the historic label of commuter rail, and that's because that's the way it's developed around the country. I don't think it's going to continue that way around the country or in Massachusetts, and by that I mean the traditional model is the trains move people in the morning hours into a central urban core, and the schedule and the planning all focuses on returning them home, so to speak, at the end of the day, and then traveling that last mile to home. One of the things is, I hate the label now, commuter rail. I've tried, unsuccessfully, to think of it as passenger rail. Just the label itself suggests a very different concept. Look at the Fall River line, particularly at the Freetown station. You have Amazon, you have a huge stop and shop transfer warehouse facility. That's where people arrive for work early in the morning. Depending on the technical capability and the trickiness of scheduling train service, we should also think that there will be people, if we do this right, who will be arriving to our area to work from other places. Maybe not as far as Boston, maybe from Taunton, maybe from Bridgewater, maybe from Brockton. The travel, and in this it's conceptually more like bus or subway service as it exists in essentially everywhere in the country, which is you're moving people back and forth throughout the day to get to the things they want to do. Business, relaxation, medical appointments, whatever. Ultimately, passenger rail, which I hope I can remember to only call it that the rest of this forum, passenger rail can function in that way as the system works out. And so people will be going in both directions. That gets back to safety because some of the parts of the route are on a single track. And in places where the trains have to pass each other, they have to be talking to each other on these side pullouts, passing zones, if you will. So the future, I can't predict. There's never a percentage in trying to. I just know that unexpected things will happen as a result of this connection.
Okay. So this question is for Gene and maybe a follow-up with Bill. The MBTA is facing significant budget shortfall. How do you see that playing out, and could it threaten the South Coast Rail project?
I actually think that's more for Chairman Straus, but I will say that we had $1 billion allocation state funding for South Coast Rail, and we're on track there. The MBTA's overall issues are being negotiated, discussed at length in the legislature, and that I will let the chair address.
So when you build the train, you then have to operate it. Two different things. It sounds so simple. All of the funding has been committed for several years in advance of what it takes to get the track done, the rolling stock in place, and to deliver, in a sense, this new car to the customer being the MBTA, who will then operate it. And then, as the question points out, the MBTA's financial situation has always been a point of contention. It is getting better. There are deficits to deal with. I should, just for the historical context, point out that up until about 20 years ago, the MBTA actually never had to operate under a budget. It would run its operations each year, and then July 1, after the fiscal year had closed, it would send a bill, an invoice, a check, like a restaurant check, to the legislature and say, here's what we spent last year, we lost some money, you need to make it up. Starting in 2001, because of legislation that was passed, the T, for the first time, had to actually prepare a budget. That's why we know there's potential deficits, because there's a budget planning process where there had not been historically. What a great operation they used to have. They could just run up a debt, and somebody else would pay it, the legislature and the governor. What we also did, though, was we dedicated a portion of the sales tax. I know there are some outside advocates, not in our area, but in the Boston area, who love to say this was a failure. In fact, $1.5 billion, nearly half of the annual budget for the T's operations, comes from that sales tax set aside. It's jumped from under $1 billion only 6 years ago to $1.5 billion now. So in 6 years, that sales tax component has jumped 50%. I think there's a reasonable expectation that that growth in the sales tax component will continue. Tough decisions lie ahead for the legislature starting next year. I will not be a part of that, but I do feel that the T, particularly under the leadership that is in place now, is well aware and will continue to work on this. But it's a live issue that the public has to pay attention to.
I just had one more point I wanted to add that the chairman alluded to. Under the new leadership, there's a strong focus on funding state of good repair, making sure what we have works, which we hadn't done in years. So his focus now is looking at what needs repair and then what needs ongoing repair and maintenance so that the infrastructure in place, which will include South Coast Rail in the final analysis, can continue to operate reliably. And that has been a strong focus of his and will remain a strong focus of his. And then the other point was, yes, once you build it, that's great. You spent the $1 billion. How do you do the operation maintenance piece of it? And that's very much within General Manager Eng's purview, and he's actively looking at how he's going to make all those pieces of the puzzle work.
Okay, thank you. So let me go back to Bill, when you're talking about budgets. The Senate version of the budget had money to keep the free fare program going with SRTA, and I think the House did not. And what do you think of, where do you think that's going to go?
My view on why the House did not include it, and we'll see what the conference report has, is no one's against free fares, but I think the view in the House was that for the regional transit authorities, which SRTA obviously is, providing public transit to the New Bedford and Fall River areas, the focus has to be on exactly what Eric has talked about, which is service. I don't care, you could charge nothing, but if the service stinks, people are not going to ride it. If the service is not safe, they would not board that bus, even if you paid them. So the focus, the perspective at this point from the House has been the RTAs, which by the way are locally governed, can determine for their region. This is not a MassDOT issue. The management comes from of the regional transit authorities by law, comes from the local municipal officials who, other than the mayors, some of the others rotate on and off the board, as to the priorities for that organization. So in this case, if the board of SRTA identifies as a priority expanded service on what Eric was describing, Sunday service, maybe extended service, maybe all kinds of other creative options, that's what we're supposed to let RTAs do. If they want, as I think the RTA in the Worcester area is doing, to focus on the fare program, that's their choice in their region. So I have confidence in the local municipal officials as to how they're running each of the RTAs, ours being, in my view, among the best run and managed in the entire state. So we do, and I'm sure Eric has the numbers, there are subsidized or cheaper fare alternatives that are in place, recognizing the serviced population that relies on SRTA vehicles at the present moment. But whether free fare is part of that mix, as I say, I prefer to leave that to the local or regional RTAs.
Eric, do you have anything to add to that?
The first day I was here, the demand for Sunday service was so great that it was incredibly difficult to find out anything else that the public wanted. It got to the point where we were really intentionally crafting all of our questions to, as much as possible, exclude Sunday service as an answer to what it is that you would like. And fare-free service in our region was not at the top. Now, there has been a crescendo recently where more advocates are pushing this idea, and there are places where it can be really valuable. But today, we could operate fare-free forever, or for a while anyway, if we just simply cut Sunday service, which would be a terrible thing to do. You know, that's 300,000 trips a year that we'd probably be cutting out of our region. So, you know, if the money is there and we can support and sustain fare-free service, we're happy to do it. But access and being able to get to your appointments, to be able to get to your loved ones, to be able to get to religious services, whatever it is, that's the most important thing from my standpoint.
Have you done surveys to see what people feel is a comfortable fare that they would be willing to pay to keep going without diminished ridership? Once you build habits of people taking the buses, you know, with free, is there a point sometime soon where you can see them relying on the service and paying for it?
So I would say that the fare set that we have is a really good sweet spot, and the pandemic helped us with that. When we stopped collecting fares to increase social distancing, that gave us an opportunity to really evaluate how our service is running, what the benefits could be from running fare free. And when we came back into collecting fares, we just cut everything in half. You know, let's just cut it in half. Let's see what happens when people are riding. And in doing that, we discovered that people were starting to adapt more to more of our multi-pass products. And so when we did come back to collecting our full fare of $1.50 cash at the fare box, we did reduce all of our multi-use passes. And we went from a system that was almost 50% cash at the fare box, how people were boarding the bus, to really only about 25% cash at the fare box when they're boarding the bus. And so from that standpoint, we feel like we've hit the right number for what the fare would be. There is also an expense to collecting fares. So, you know, it wouldn't really make sense for us to go any lower at this point. But my biggest concern is the yo-yo effect. So we had fare free for a year or so during the pandemic. We came back in, we stepped into a half fare, we stepped into our new full fare, and now we're back to fare free. It's great that people are adapting to it and like it. And should this continue for FY25, that's wonderful. But I still need to be prepared to stand up fare collection in FY26 until there is some sort of understanding that that's the permanent future. So we're not seeing these savings until that is really codified somewhere.
I just wanted to open up, make sure that everybody out here who has questions can ask them, and it's not just me asking the question. So if you, anybody out here in the audience wants to ask a question, jump right in. Oh, go ahead, Jack. Jack always has
At the
questions.
risk of having one other person from the Bedford Light, for anybody who possibly doesn't know, I'm Jack Corey, problems from the light. I guess this question is most directed to Jen and Bill. Some of the parcels for the accelerated development, housing development, adjacent to the Wales Street parking lot, Wales Street station, are environmentally compromised. F&B Tire is a big operation there. The adjacent Tixlogan area is a lot of environmental problems. Any developer is going to have to deal with those environmental issues. Is there any sort of amendment or ways to develop environmentally compromised areas? But is there anything that has been done specifically for South Coast Rail just to help land like that be developed? Because it seems to me that that's going to be a hard parcel to develop next to the Wales parking lot.
So I think everyone knows, I'll paraphrase the question just because I'm not sure how the sound system works through to those who will later be watching on video or remotely. So Jack's question is focused on some of the parcels that, if people can picture them in their mind's eye, either abut or are very close to the downtown station location near the waterfront, where historically there once was a station. It wasn't in service when I arrived in the area, but the old building was there and it burned down. But that region of the city, and Jack made reference to those parcels being, I think your phrase was environmentally compromised. Certainly in that area historically, it's one of the dark chapters, I would say, of the legacy of certain large employers in the New Bedford area who viewed the lands around there and the harbor itself as a place to dump heavy metals and most prominently PCB chemicals. And so for good reason, 35 to 40 years ago, the Environmental Protection Agency classified that area as a major Superfund site. Much has been cleaned up substantially, certainly in the water and on the land. And I do recall litigation that the city, starting in the early 2000s, completed roughly 2014-15, the City of New Bedford successfully brought various court cases and recovered, and on this site, I'm going on memory, so I could be wrong, but something in the area of $10 to $15 million as reimbursements for the cost of restoring environmentally those parcels of land. What the city specific work does that entitled it to the reimbursement in the litigation, I couldn't say, but that's roughly the history. As a cleanup methodology, going on my own memories of the PCB cleanup and groups like Hands Across the River many years ago, the cleanup attainment level for PCB and metal reductions is often, and it may be true with those parcels, at a level that permits some levels of activity, but not all levels of activity, especially residential housing. And that attainment level, and I could be wrong on this, but that attainment level is not the cleanup level that the EPA requested for those particular parcels. So the parking lot that you see, the Whale's Tooth, associated, call them commercial type uses, are appropriate. So each site, as the different speakers were talking about, the development districts, the opportunities for commercial housing, etc., always comes down to what's specifically appropriate and permittable for that site. That site, I'm sorry to say, probably cannot escape the legacy of our industrial past here to be eligible for all levels of use. But I have no doubt that in the planning office at the city, they are right on top of this. So that's my way of politely saying, I hope I'm going to get some help with the answer here.
I'm mainly talking about the parcels, and that's retired for sale.
And I'm mainly talking about the parcels directly on the east side of Route 18, because I know that there are parcels on the west side of Route 18 that are very developable, the Armory and all that, but I'm mainly talking about the places where the tire processing facilities are, the residential neighborhood that is in that area. They strike me as, unlike where Taunton, you already have a project, on the books, and Middleborough, them talking about a project, that those projects directly adjacent to the downtown New Bedford station are going to be difficult or challenging to develop. I'm just wondering what the state of thought is on that.
And so, Jack, I think you're talking about the whole area that's bound by 195, Route 18, and the train station, correct? So that includes our TOD districts for the zoning purposes, as well as our urban renewal plan, urban renewal districts. So it's a kind of a combination of things, which I would say is that we focus our attention through all the means that are possible to us, right? I'm going to say we have our urban renewal districts that focus on the certain areas around that station. And first I want to make a point that not all of the parcels are environmentally contaminated. We want to be clear that that whole district is not environmentally contaminated, though there are a lot of issues in the area that are known. There are some unknowns, but not every private parcel is contaminated, so we want to be clear on that. And then the main things that we want to talk about is zoning, right? So that's why a lot of the zoning requirements, we've had issues there in the past where it was a patchwork of zoning. It was, if you looked at it, literally it was all these different colors with multiple different overlays. What we most recently did with the urban renewal districts is removed a lot of that, clarified that. So that's one piece that promotes development on the portion that's the more northern portion. The portion around this train station, that's for the TOD districts. And as we've explained before, particularly with, I know Grace did the coverage in the fall, we were working on our TOD districts. We did come out publicly. There was the change with the MBTA Communities Act, and so we kind of put a pause. We got a grant to get our consultant on board, and we wanted to make sure that our zoning does comply with that act, and we'll be bringing that forth in the fall of this year. Right now we have our draft. We're submitting that for a review before the Office of Housing and Livable Communities for their initial review. That takes a couple months, and then they'll tell us that it complies. There's a model we have to run, and then that will be presented for city council adoption in the fall for that area. And again, so the zoning pieces promote development by allowing different uses there than we allow now, so that higher density. So there's that attractive piece for the development. Then if we look at the layers of how we incentivize development, is also looking at our infrastructure, our transportation. We've gotten a federal RAISE grant to look at the corridor of MacArthur Drive. So a lot of the stuff that was identified in the urban renewal plans is the infrastructure. So we have outdated infrastructure. We have roads over there that are, you know, the pavement's starting to go away. You can see the cobblestones underneath from the original roadways. We have the underground infrastructure that needs to be fixed. So we applied for grants to do the final design and engineering of MacArthur Drive through that corridor to connect to the highway, to connect through that area. We've sat down with 195 MassDOT project. We were very concerned about that project because of the impact as it was proposed to have it walled off. We worked with them to make a design that ensured that the under viaduct area will be complementary to our future phase 1 of Route 18, because a major portion of the impacts of why we don't see a lot of development in that area, besides the environmental contamination, is the fact that you've hemmed in that neighborhood by 2 highways. And so the final phase of Route 18 is important. And so as we look at transportation connections and ability to move through your community to the train, from the train, to the buses, to the port, getting that active transportation through the port, all of those investments in infrastructure matter. And then that also will incentivize development. So I think it's a large answer, and I thank you all for going on that journey, but there's a lot of pieces that we have in place that are moving towards getting that area more attractive for development, and it's through those plans and identified projects, federal and state support, to really make it a vital area.
And I just want to throw in that we, on this project, through the chairman's advocacy, we're going to have a beautiful pedestrian bridge that crosses what is now Route 18 and Acushnet, so that everything on that side is very easily accessible to people. Get them right down to the platform. And while there is an authorized use limitation where the station is, because of the Superfund issue, we worked very closely with the EPA and Mass DEP on all our permitting for that. So we were very careful not to touch the cap or anything else, but it is a perfect utilization, that station site, perfect utilization for that area.
Okay, I think I wanted to ask just a little bit about the number of riders that the MBTA expects on the new line, and how you came to decide and determine what those numbers are, and how the rail will sustain itself.
Sure. So our ridership numbers now are a bit stale, and they were compiled pre-pandemic. And as we all know, travel patterns have changed. As the chairman alluded to, it's not commuter rail. General Manager Ang refers to it as regional rail. You can get to everything at whatever time of day it is. That's what we want. We want service that meets the needs of the people who are using the service. Our initial numbers from back in the day were an additional 1,610 riders each way, so 3,220, on top of what already comes out of Middleborough, which is in the 3,000 or 4,000s, depends on what time of year and everything else. Remember, many people from New Bedford and Fall River and points in between were traveling to Lakeville to get on the train. They now have stations closer to home they can access, so they don't have to do the, I'm stuck behind a dump truck with 3 school buses, I'm never going to make the train. They'll have other options that are far more convenient, and that's part of it. The way we ascertain what those numbers are is extremely complex, and I wouldn't even try to explain it, but there's this giant black box that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council has, and they put in all kinds of data. A lot of it comes from SRPED, a lot of it comes from the communities, and a lot of it is based on growth overall. So you take all these different factors, you put them in the box, and it spits out a number. So again, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the 3,200 number is what we came up with, and I don't expect to have 3,200 on day one, but as was mentioned earlier, a lot of the people that ultimately will ride the train are people who don't live here right now. And that is absolutely true. And also, we will see a significant amount of what I call reverse commute. People coming down to enjoy what we have here in New Bedford. People coming down to go to UMass Dartmouth, which is going to be a new option for people who don't live in the region. And people who are interested in ocean studies and things of that nature. We now open up this entire new opportunity for people who didn't even know it existed. So I see the ridership numbers as a bit stale, certainly fluid, but I think something that will be changing, and I think it's a good starting point to say we're adding about 3,200 trips a day to the existing 3,500 or so currently using the Lakeville station.
Go ahead, Paul.
I'll just jump in for a second too. Jay makes a good point about people coming down here. We talk about who's going up and who's coming down. You mentioned economic development before. We're talking ridership numbers, but I think that changes all the time. I love examples. I mentioned the young lady going to MIT. Another example is our Realtor Association, National Association of Realtors. They have their conference in Boston this November. There'll be over 25,000 people there. They will come again, so that's good. But if the rail were coming down, we would have. Anybody that goes to conferences understands when you go to a conference for 5 or 6 days, you don't just sit in the city of Boston. Boston's great, but it's not the only place there is. To be able to bring conference attendees down to New Bedford and to Fall River for the museums and the Battleship Cove and the Portuguese food and everything else that we have down the South Coast makes a huge difference. That's where we're going to see, different economic booms. That's where we're going to see various amounts of riders at times. I often say this isn't a whole puzzle. This is one piece of a puzzle. But it is certainly a big piece, and once it comes, and I'm glad it's coming in early 2025 or sometime in there, I think it's going to be, it's going to bring a lot of ridership both ways, and for various reasons that we don't even right now begin to understand, with visitors coming into Boston and likewise.
Okay. Grace, did you have more questions you had sent me? Grace, you had a few questions you had sent me. Did you have any that you want to ask yourself here?
Yeah, I did want to ask Paul, we've heard from you about the impacts of the train itself, but, you have an eye on the development sphere, people in the real estate sphere. How do you think those people are going to react to the zoning changes, these transit-oriented development districts that the city is bringing forward?
So I heard her part of the question, but I'm sorry, what was the whole question again?
Sorry, I'll repeat it. So you've talked about the impact of the train itself, but I also want to hear from you what you think the impact will be of the city's zoning changes with the transit-oriented districts and how people in the real estate sphere are going to react to that.
Sure. So obviously, as I said before, we have a lack of inventory. So these transit-oriented development projects, MBTA communities, projects such as those are going to be helpful for the city of New Bedford moving forward. Zoning changes obviously will help where we need to be, especially around the train stations. I personally believe, like many, that parking, while some feel there's an issue of parking, when you're talking about around the train stations themselves, historically speaking, there are differences between homes or apartments that are built with less parking restrictions. This is not something we're just throwing out there. There are actual numbers out there to support that around train stations, we don't need the amount of parking that we do, say, in a heavily dense residential area outside of the train station. So these transit-oriented development opportunities, as well as things like the MBTA communities, I think are going to be helpful for us as we move forward and try to build some inventory. Now, that doesn't mean that we squash every inch of the areas with houses, because transit-oriented development isn't just about homes. It's about, like we said before, it's about businesses, it's about coffee shops, it's about opportunities around the rails. To bring in not only homes, but businesses as well. and some nice open space too to kind of complement everything. So if you're asking about the transit-oriented development in real estate, the MBTA Communities Act in real estate, I think it's beneficial. Noting that the MBTA Communities is not about making us build certain developments, it's about just allowing developers the opportunity to develop. Those are all good things in a time where we need housing.
Maybe Jennifer could answer that a little bit too. In terms of the different kinds of businesses that will be coming, coffee shops. In terms of grocery stores and that sort of thing. If you're living in an area where now you don't have a car to go to Market Basket or somewhere else or to Straus, that there might be something closer to you in those areas.
Sure. So as I always say, we're the planners. We don't have a magic wand. We can't say what exactly is going to go there or there. But what we do is we create the regulations that allow for the development that we'd like to see in certain areas. So gets it back to the question you asked earlier about what do we see in 25 years, 10 years, is that we want to see a livable community where you can walk, where you can go across interchange between Route 18 across downtown. We see an extension of downtown if we're talking about right up the Klasky Common, the TOD, the district right out here by the train station and the downtown. We want to have it be an area that has exactly as you're saying. You can walk to your grocery store. You can get a bottle of wine for dinner. You can potentially go to a job that might be there. Might be an office space or creative space. You're going to have some spaces to recreate, where you can actually go and enjoy a concert, or not a concert, but a little music while you're eating dinner or something like that. So these spaces that are engaging with the community, and that's what the zoning looks at. It looked at freeing up and adding that into these areas. Because if you look at the areas today around the train station, they're predominantly zoned industrial, and that's why we have industrial uses, right? So that's how we zone is what we get, and if what we allow for changes, we hope that it would allow to see that development come along. And that's how we see it. And then the last thing to the question that was posed to Paul, TOD is an attractive zoning type. It's a recognized zoning type for developers, right? It's a known. They see TOD, they understand what it is. There are specific developers out there that do that kind of work. They understand how to do mixed use and how to do it well. There's also ones who are very creative and really understand and have done it in districts where we have environmental contamination. They know how to get the grants, the funds, the different tax credits. So it's an attractive piece to also have as a title for zoning that's a known for developers. So I think that's why it's also attractive.
Okay. Do you know of since we're talking in the abstract now, years from now, and you're not going to decide we're going to put a grocery store here or a restaurant there. Is there a model that for a city or a similar sized community to New Bedford that you might be looking at and saying that's where New Bedford could be in 5, 10, or 15 years?
I wouldn't say we have a specific model, right? We've seen it done well across the country in different areas throughout the country, as well as within the state itself. I mean, Jean pointed to our local communities around the area that have had some development. And so it's very consistent type of development that you're going to see. You're going to see more multifamily housing. You're going to see first floor retail. You're going to see that kind of activity. You're going to see some nice landscaping, some engaging public spaces. And so I think that's a model. I don't want to point to one specific one because that's always, someone will say, no, that's not what I want. But there's multiple different types throughout the state as well as across the country where you can see TOD done well.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from audience? Okay. All right, yes.
A little clarity. So, in terms of what you're speaking to, is this zoning that has already been determined, or is this something that is a vision looking forward in terms of the status of where we are with the zoning next to these transit sites, the new transit
So there is a website, if you go to, I can send you the link, but it's also on SRPED's website for our transit-oriented development districts. So there's been multiple years of studies that we've done with our regional planning agency around both train station areas. And then on those, you can see the zoning district boundaries as they were originally proposed. We are looking at them right now to finalize them, but they will be a public process. They have been a public process for their development, and then for the ultimate adoption, it will be going before City Council, and that's a public process between the City Council, the Planning Board, for that, and that's what we're going to be doing in the fall. So as of right now, you can go on that website, you can see the density that we're proposing. The specific zoning isn't posted at this moment because we literally just made sure that we're revising it in line with the state requirement, but we will be posting that as we get closer to the end of the summer to be posting that publicly for the actual zoning text. But the general content and the idea behind it is available on our website, and you can see all of the studies that went behind that and all of the details, and kind of a quick breakdown with design guidelines that kind of show and you can kind of visualize what that would look like.
Okay, so nothing's in the determined.
No, so it's not officially adopted. We have some draft language, and again, we did those studies in the past. We've had some public meetings in the past. We've been a little bit of a pause, mostly working internally on some stuff this past year because the state had this new policy for MBTA communities, and we became an MBTA community last year. And so, as an MBTA community, you're required to have certain multifamily housing within a half-mile distance of the train stations. And there's a model that we had to put our zoning into. And so again, this is our draft zoning that we put into this model, and they run it on our existing parcels. So it's a little agnostic on what's actually out there today. It actually runs as if there's nothing on the ground. And so it runs it on every single parcel in the designated area, and then it applies the zoning to it, and it includes how many parking spaces, what's the density, what's the dimensional requirements, and it kind of runs this model, and I'm not an expert on it, right? But they run the model, and then it says whether or not you'll be able to create that percentage of density, percentage of housing that you're required to have in your district, and whether or not you comply with that state regulation. And so when that came out, we had a zoning draft, but again, we put it on pause a little bit until we could get a consultant on board to make sure that we comply with that zoning ordinance. We're confident at this point that we do, but again, we're submitting that to the state because they have a pre-review process. We're going to get that pre-review, and then we're going to be bringing it back to City Council and the public the end of the summer for adoption in the fall.
Okay, Peter, did you have a question about multimodal transportation, bicycles?
Yes, one of our loyal readers had written us with a question. They wanted to learn more about the plans for a bicycle infrastructure.
Are you referring to the stations?
I believe the biking infrastructure in its entirety.
Okay, yeah, that's a very popular question too, because I think you heard Jen allude to what they're going to do on the, well, they're going to make 18 a boulevard at some point. And it is a complete streets model, which does include the bike and ped path and everybody else. Then all our stations do have bike shelters, because we really do want to encourage mode shift. If it's not a blizzard and you can ride your bike to the station, we certainly hope you would do that rather than get in the car, because what's the purpose of having a train? One of the key purposes, besides making a convenient, reliable transit option available to people, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And people on bikes are very aware of that, and I know people in this region have been actively pursuing a whole bike network. But in terms of the train, we're very conscious of the fact that we will have people arriving on bicycles and they need a shelter to put their bicycles in, and hopefully on some trains actually load the bicycles onto the train.
Okay. Are there any more questions, Abby? Yes, go ahead.
I understand that the coming of the passenger rail will reshape certain and local transportation, and sure, SRTA is trying to be increasingly responsive to local needs and alert to them. My question is, in the evolution of our local transportation options, including bicycle lanes, etc., is anyone keeping track of youth-oriented transportation? A perennial moan from the Greater New Bedford Youth Alliance is that there are many young people in the city that are without after-school opportunities, and the number one reason they're deprived of those is inadequate transportation in the afternoon. And I'm wondering if anyone in the city or SRTA is sort of monitoring what the potential need is and how it may be factored in to these overall plans. Not everybody is headed to work in Boston or pick up a bottle of wine before heading home to the condo after walking to the grocery store. There are over 13, middle and high school here in the city. There are 10,000 young people. Not all of them have a parent who can shuttle them around or driver's licenses or a car. And that it'd be nice to know that some effort is being made to factor in their needs also.
Here, did I get it this time? It's a little different than the last one. So we don't have the direct technical capacity to track based on demographics. We do have to sample and do surveys from time to time to help us to zone in on that a little bit. We are able to track where people are getting on and off buses, so we do have a good sense when, certainly when high school is in session, college is in session, that the number of passengers that we're serving there. We've had a program with UMass Dartmouth for probably going on 10 years where students can simply flash their student ID and board the bus and we build that back to the university. It was really successful when we first started it. It has petered off a little bit. But we do work with all the schools really in the area to some extent, maybe more so in Fall River than in New Bedford. So zoning in on student access to jobs isn't something that we've had a chance to look at, but we're certainly happy to work with anybody to help make sure that we're serving everybody that needs us.
Any more questions? I'd like to circle back just a little bit to where we started with Bill. And what do you say to the cynics now who look at this, the rail project, and say, well, yeah, you've told us this before, you've told us this before, it's still not going to happen. And you don't have to look very far on our Facebook page before you find 20 or 30 of those comments in a row.
Great question, and it's become one of my more common comments, is that on my rep's Facebook page, I often will post updates, courtesy of MassDOT, but things that are going on with regard to South Coast Rail. And I now, as I did I think earlier in the week, or last week, I will start off my comments by saying, every time I post about South Coast Rail, invariably, and I understand why, someone will post a comment that says, I'll believe it when I see it. So as those comments started to occur, and believe me, I understand, I began to post pictures of progress, of overpasses, track being laid, station completion. And so I would say, look, I know somebody will say, I'll believe it when I see it. Here are some pictures if you see it. And so then I guess there's a learning function that goes on. The comments then shifted to, I'll believe it when I can ride the train. So I appreciate the progress because people are seeing it. They see the stations, they see the construction work. Each of us can see that. Starting yesterday, you can see trains going up and down the track. That's not just for some Disney World visual effect, it's because the trains are coming. Should people remain impatient? Sure. But I think if, as each stage occurs, I don't know when that people will be able to board the train, pay a fare, and take a ride. I don't know what those people will say to the posting, but I'm sure they'll have something that, well, it wasn't on time, or what I hope to hear is there were not enough seats. That would be my ideal response that I would hope for, because that we can continue to plan around.
If I could just add, his posts are great, and he really does preface them with, but I know you don't believe this, but, and I just wanted to emphasize the last point he made. The test trains are not a Disney experiment or visual. They're real. They're now testing every grade crossing to make sure all the signals align properly, function properly, operate properly. And they will test each grade crossing repeatedly, starting at 25 miles an hour, increasing to 45 miles an hour, and ultimately to maximum authorized speed, which in some areas, and it was done here today, 79 miles an hour. This is all different for us. We haven't had to deal with this in the past, but that's the reality. You get through this testing and commissioning phase, we will have a train, hopefully, with no seats. And we will have, finally, what we've waited over 30 years for and haven't had in over 60, the opportunity that we deserve to get on a train and go to Boston or points in between, and vice versa, offer the opportunity for people in greater Boston and points in between the opportunity to see what we have here. So please be extra vigilant as you are near railroad tracks. They are not recreational areas. They're dangerous. Trespassing is illegal. But it's also now very, very much a concern of everybody who's involved with this. We want people to stay safe, which means you need to stay away from the right-of-way. Even where there's fencing, sometimes it's a narrow right-of-way and there's a fence there. If you're between a train and the fence, remember the train overhangs the track by several feet. You may not have clearance. So we really want to urge everyone to stay safe, stay away, watch the trains, take pictures all you want, because I was doing that yesterday. It was kind of exciting to see those new Hyundai Rotem coaches, bi-level coaches, in a real MBTA locomotive instead of a Mass Coastal Freight locomotive, driving what's going to be on these tracks in the coming months and taking us hopefully many years into the future.
Andy, yeah, I'd just like to say one thing back to the comments about it never coming, right? We see even my coalition, the coalition that we've had for almost 14 years now, we're still constantly hearing it. And all I say is, for a conversation that started in 1993, we've made massive advances just in the last 5 years. I mean, for a project that takes so much to do. And it's coming, and a little delayed because of reasons that are completely normal in safety in areas, especially after seeing what's happened over the last couple of years around the U.S., right? So as far as the coalition goes, we're extremely happy that in the last 5 years we've made so many advances. Mass DOT, MBTA, Governor Baker, now Governor Healy, and the South Coast delegation, including the chairman, have all been in front of it the whole time, and we really appreciate what they've done, and excited to see what's going to happen next year.
Great. So I'll have one more question from me, and anybody else. Okay, Jack.
If I can have one more question too. Can someone explain this latest delay that will end next May? Can someone give specifics as to why it takes an entire year to do the safety checks, and how it is that they miscalculated that they could have had them done by last fall and then this July, and now it takes another whole year to do these safety checks? I don't know what goes into a safety check and how many crossings there are, but it does seem like a long time.
And certainly it feels like a long time, but what the general manager, when he came to New Bedford and Fall River last week, Phil Eng, identified was, here's where we are today, Monday, which occurred yesterday. Trains will now be riding on the tracks at speeds that had not been seen for decades. And he mentioned the end point. And I don't want to go, well, maybe I should, too far into the weeds. The end point is that day of so-called fair service, meaning somebody is paying a member of the public to ride the train. That is not one event that goes from yesterday to that event. There are in-between events that occur to get to that final, here are the keys, you just bought the car, you can drive it out of the driveway. Critical point is when the Commonwealth, as the contractor, has completed construction of all components. You've got the track, you've got the cross ties, you've got the overpasses, you've got the stations, you've got the signalization, you've got the positive train control. It's a complex machine, but there is a point under federal law where the Commonwealth says to the Federal Railroad Administration, here is this new start expansion. They have the maps, everything like that. You now, under federal law, must do the federal approval and sign off. That is not a fixed period of time. Experience around the country suggests it can go for about 90 days. That is not a certainty. So when the general manager announced the schedule, and as I say, everybody shares the frustration. I know in my conversations with him, he shares the frustration. But what he is given so that no one is in a situation where they say, gee, we got it wrong. It's another month. It's another 2 months. He has given the maximum conservative estimate at each stage. Now, I talked about the last 90 days, which might be 95, it might be 80, but 90 days before the Federal Railroad Administration.
So where did these previous deadlines come from?
I know you were sitting there, Jack, so I know you heard me. I said something, and it's not like I'm looking to make news necessarily, but I said something that wasn't said by the general manager because I'm at a station where, so to speak, where I can be a little more free. Here's the picture I painted, here's the picture I'll paint again for you. 2 years ago, just as a rough time period, the MBTA system generally was operating without full safety protections in place. A different federal agency came in with regard to subway, especially, to effectively take over operation. What that meant was, clearly, when Governor Healy came into office, there was a vacancy, not surprisingly, in the position of general manager of the MBTA. Phil Lang was hired, began to work, I think roughly 13 months ago, maybe 14 months ago. Given the track record, I hate those analogies, given the track record with regard to safety issues especially, and the fact that it came to be revealed in his early days, the Green Line extension had been opened too early, so we had, and still have, this system of forced slowdowns to protect employee and public life and limb in the operation. There were people who caused those problems. They may have been and were throughout the system. So one of the things, maybe less well covered, less shared perhaps, is that some people who were working for the MBTA when the Healy administration came into office, but especially when Mr. Ang took over, some people are no longer there. It has publicly been reported and acknowledged that one of those was involved, or a number of people, involved with supervision of South Coast Rail. And that position was filled with someone new 2 or 3 months ago. And it's been stated that review is going on. So I think I painted the picture that says there were people who worked there who weren't doing the job that was expected of them with regard to delivery of the final product so that testing could begin. So we are at a point, and I don't mind acknowledging it, that is the point where we are today. So why did it happen?
The problem we have is that all these missed deadlines has resulted in people not really meeting the May deadline either. They just think, well, maybe they put it a year out so they possibly can meet that. But the credibility of the way the NBT has operated for the last 30, 40 years, the way that this project has blown through 2 deadlines, that I just don't think anybody, people I talk to, just don't find any of it credible.
And I'm not going to disagree with you. The credibility was self-inflictedly, if that's a word, shot. But that is why they went outside, so to speak, the state and hired somebody with real training experience in New York State. Not that things are perfect there, I don't mean to suggest that. But somebody with real experience who could look at it and not be in that or affected by that culture of instances where, and you can run the list as I can, where non-performance was either excused or ignored or not addressed. And so if there were people working on South Coast Rail, as there were in other places where problems have shown up, when they're no longer working there and they didn't depart with a gold watch and a farewell retirement party, it doesn't take a math wizard to see that the numbers that add up suggest that person wasn't doing their job. I think I'm being clear. I feel like it anyway.
Okay, well, one more question? Okay, we're ready to wrap it up. We've gone past our 90 minutes.
I'd like to do a follow-up to Jack's excellent question. It almost seems like there's more of the story unsaid tonight than said, Jack. Did you hear me, Representative Straus? I can repeat. It looked like you didn't hear me.
I didn't hear, just as you turned, I didn't hear the final comment. I apologize.
Okay, I'm getting to the question, but I just said I think there's more to this story than we're hearing tonight. And it's almost more revealing what you didn't say than what you did say. So I want to ask you this very common sense type of question. Do you have a timeline that says in detail, almost like an engineering timeline, I think there's a word for that, a project management timeline that could be made public, maybe it already has been, that would tell people like Jack and I that have common sense questions about why it should take this long for this rail system to be operational. We think it seems an unnecessarily long time as lay people.
Right. I don't have an engineering degree, and it shows. But more to the point, as I acknowledged with Jack, the MBTA, in a self-inflicted way, as an entity or an organization, has ruined its own credibility. So when you say, hey, I don't believe you, I understand why. But if you ask me, as if I'm hiding something from you, and I'm not, what exactly is the date? Like, you guys must have some secret manual that tells you the date. What I've tried to indicate, testing means testing. That means there is always a possibility from a scientific and engineering standpoint that the testing could reveal a problem. If the testing reveals a problem, something I don't believe will happen, but I can give you no assurance on that, and it has to be fixed, then all of a sudden timelines change. So if somebody says to you, I promise it will be done by a certain date, that the testing will be completed, even though they have professional assurance that it will be, they'd be deceiving you. Based on Phil Ang's experience and his stated intention, which was impressed on him not only by the delegation, but by the governor herself, announce a date once, time period when you think service will complete, because you will now, as the 1 year plus X months general manager, destroy your credibility. He hasn't given me any reason to think that he has no credibility here. He's delivered a schedule that has been acted upon on reduction of the slow speed zones in the subways, on all the lines where the work is proceeding in the city. So I don't expect you to be happy. No one is. I don't expect you to even accept my answer. But I will not, because I cannot, tell you a specific date. No one could, unless they wanted to lie to you, that on X date service will begin. As the testing gets through these different milestones, for instance, a significant one, which will have significant meaning, and I hope people look ahead to that, is when the Commonwealth officially delivers the finished product, so to speak, to the Federal Railroad Administration. That's a big date, and when that occurs, with some more, as you get closer to the date, assurance, you can say when the public starts to ride the trains.
A retired engineer. I'm going to try to get it.
No, I expected as much. That's why I said I'm the only one who's not an engineer, because I'm not stupid enough to say, I wonder if you are, because I knew already you were from the way you posed the question. I've been around this too.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'd like to respectfully follow up with your office, maybe the MBTA top management itself, because I believe, I can't swear to it, but I believe there are, in fact, timelines. Just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean they don't exist. And I might be able to make a federal information request to get those.
There are specific portions of the testing and commissioning that are relatively finite, but to the chairman's point, one failure in one area means a retest of everything. So what they're doing now, as I mentioned earlier, is the grade crossing signals, making sure those all go, and those are at the 3 different speeds, right? That's going to take a chunk of time. We've already done the automatic train control testing. That's done. That's the one basically controls the train speed. Done. Moving on, we've made great progress with the FRA. They've given the MBTA permission to do this next phase of all the crossings. That takes a chunk of time. Again, any problems, any tweaks, you have to redo everything. After that, we do what was alluded to earlier, positive train control. That's the piece, very high technology piece, nationally required, mandated for all the right reasons. That's the one that can take control of the train if an engineer isn't aware he's entering a slow zone, or there's another train, a disabled train, or whatever reason, maybe tuned out for whatever reason, then PTC takes control. That's another whole testing scenario that right now we envision, as of the discussion last week with the general manager, to be done by about January 31. At that point, we go into the Federal Railroad Administration's demonstration service, roughly 90 days, where the train will travel on the exact schedule that comes out of the MBTA for South Coast Rail, and it will go back and forth, looking for anything that could be amiss with the signals. There's a pinch point we have to deal with where 3 lines come together near Braintree, making sure all that works, making sure we can park at South Station successfully and get out for the next train to come in. All of that takes time too. And a lot of this is newer in terms of safety requirements, because we've had issues nationally with railroad safety. And there's no way, and the GM will tell you this, there's no way he or the Federal Railroad Administration will launch revenue service until they are 100% sure that everything's functioning properly.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up now. Thank you all for being here. You're welcome to come up and talk to our panelists individually as we break things up. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists.